Hey everyone, we're back with part 2 of lecture 14, and we've been talking about Missouri waiting in the wings as the next territory to enter into the Union, but that we have a very delicate balance now between 11 free states and 11 slave states. So people are wondering, northern and southern politicians are very much wondering what's going to take place. So what will have to happen after a lot of vigorous debate between northern politicians and southern politicians will be a compromise between both sides. And I do want to point out to you that you might see this deal also described as the Compromise of 1820. All right, so you might see it listed as the Missouri Compromise, or you might also see it referred to as the Compromise of 1820. I want you to be familiar with both of those terms, please. All right, and so what we're seeing is among northern politicians, they are increasingly worried that if slavery continues to move westward, that before long, that the South will be able to have more representatives in the House of Representatives, and that there's some political ramifications to that. Also, too, there's some moral objections. We're increasingly seeing the abolitionist movement in the United States beginning to gain strength, and the abolitionists are interested in abolishing slavery everywhere. So we're also seeing among many of these northern politicians arguing with their southern colleagues that slavery is simply a moral wrong and that slavery should not be allowed to move westward as a result. For Southerners, however, they are digging in their heels, and to them, they're going they're very much on the defensive at this point in time. For Southern politicians, they want to ensure that slavery gets to move westward. They see it as integral to their way of life, their economy, and so both sides are really having a long, drawn-out debate over this. So the Compromise of 1820, or also known as the Missouri Compromise, will admit Missouri as a slave state. You can see it here on the map. And then to keep that balance in Congress, the same number of slave states versus the same number of free states, then Maine will be admitted as a free state into the Union at the exact same time. So they're trying to keep this kind of tenuous balance in line. And then looking to the future, you'll notice the third provision of the compromise is that there will be an arbitrary line drawn across the West at 36 degrees 30 minutes. And any future territories that come in south of that line can come in as slave states if they choose to do so. But any states coming in from these territories north of that line must come in as free states. So slavery will therefore be prohibited north of that line. Now, neither side particularly cares for this compromise, but it is what it is. They realize they're never going to solve this issue to the liking of everyone, and so it will temporarily, and I do mean just very temporarily, subside, cause tensions to subside between both sides. So we've been talking quite a bit about domestic policy because there's been a bunch going on, during this period of rapid industrialization and westward movement. But we also need to take a few minutes to talk about foreign policy and how it's going to change a little bit under President James Monroe through his Monroe Doctrine. And here's the deal. By the early 1820s, much of Latin America is becoming independent of Spanish control. So take a look, for instance, at this map, which shows just a wave of independence movements making its way through Central and South America. Many of these countries formerly under the control of Spain are rising up, some of them motivated, for instance, by the American Revolution or the French Revolution, now seizing their independence. And so from the standpoint of President Monroe, the United States supports these independence movements. We understand, oppression at the hands of a wicked colonial power, as they said it back in the day. So we want to support many of these countries, but also Monroe is thinking about the United States as being sort of a protector of some of these new nations that have just emerged from under Spanish control. He's worried that some of these newly minted nations with virtually no military of their own, that they might fall prey to other colonial powers, that they might have gotten the Spanish expelled, but what's to stop the British from coming in now, or the Russians, or the French? All right, so that's why we end up with the Monroe Doctrine. And at the heart of the Monroe Doctrine is the principle of non-interference. All right, that's a very important point. Non-interference is the cornerstone of the Monroe Doctrine, in which essentially the United States would agree not to interfere, right, or intervene in European affairs. That if two countries are going at it, fine, let them have it. The United States is not going to try to stake a claim in those conflicts. But in exchange, President Monroe expected that European powers would also agree not to interfere in the Americas. All right, so as you can see in his direct words, the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. So in essence, what the Monroe Doctrine does is put a big keep out sign, if you will, on the Western Hemisphere, that the United States, and it's implied through the Monroe Doctrine, that if some of these colonial powers decided to try and come in to Latin America, that the United States would decide to flex its muscles, so to speak, and perhaps intervene in this case. So the Monroe Doctrine will kind of set U.S. foreign policy with regard to the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, arguably for the next 150 years of the nation's history. So this is a pretty important development, even though at the time when it was issued, European powers could have cared less. All right, they basically didn't pay any attention to what was going on. Now, the election of 1824, here's where the era of good feelings, as it was known, will come to an end. We've essentially had a period of one-party rule. Remember how we said one of the effects of the Hartford Convention was that the party of the Federalists was branded as traitors, and they basically fell apart after that. So you just have one political party, the Democratic-Republican Party, running people for office. Well, the problem by 1824, though, is it's been, a decade after the end of the war, is that this one party is not big enough to accommodate the many different viewpoints that Americans have during this period. Also, what you see is by 1824, you have the vote deeply split amongst a number of candidates for office that year. You end up with 5 men competing for the chance to run for the presidency. John Quincy Adams, the son of former President John Adams, John C. Calhoun, William Crawford, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson, the man who had first earned nationwide notoriety as a hero of the War of 1812 through the Battle of New Orleans. So these 5 men are all running for the vote. The vote ends up becoming deeply split. Now, with regards to the popular vote, who the people want to see in office, at the local level, you can see the chart here. Jackson, Andrew Jackson, or General Jackson, as he preferred to be called, he was the one that won the popular vote in this election. However, he did not win the Electoral College vote. All right, in this contest, John Quincy Adams will end up, shall we say, doing a few backroom dealings with Henry Clay, and these two candidates for office will manage to get enough support within the Electoral College that John Quincy Adams will become president in 1824. This will infuriate Andrew Jackson and his supporters, who will call it the corrupt bargain, so to speak. They will talk about a stolen election, that the people actually wanted him to be president, yet he had gotten sidelined. So Andrew Jackson, as we'll talk more about in our next lecture, is not someone that you want to have as an enemy. He will make a vow in 1824 that he will run for the presidency again in 1828, and that he will win it, and he will be successful, as we'll see.